So, welcome everybody to our third edition of Radical Mindfulness. And tonight we are starting with chapter 2. We're on page 27 if you happen to have a hard copy of the book. And I'll turn it over to you, Matthew, to get us started.
All right. Chapter 2, The Will to Supremacy. First starts off with a quote from Adrienne Marie Brown: "We will not cancel us. Supremacy is our ongoing pandemic. It partners with every other sickness to tear us from life or from lives worth living." On February 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. gave what would become his last sermon at Atlanta's Ebenezer Baptist Church. He was assassinated by a white supremacist 2 months later. While not one of his better-known sermons, it was one of his favorites. He felt it distilled the message of his 14-year public ministry. In the sermon, King introduces a concept that is a key building block for what I will call the will to supremacy, the drum major instinct. According to King, there is, deep down within all of us, an instinct. It's a kind of drum major instinct, a desire to be out front, a desire to lead the parade, a desire to be first. It is something that runs the whole gamut of life. For King, the drum major instinct am I, provides one explanation for the persistence of dominative social relations across the axes of class, race, and nation. But it also explores poor interpersonal behavior such as boasting or talking too much, which most of us have witnessed and participated in. I first read about King's sermon in an article by a black Buddhist author, Charles Johnson, in the magazine Shambhala Sun, now named Lion's Roar. Throughout his life, King was in conversation with Buddhists such as Thich Nhat Hanh, whom he nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in '67, and was also deeply influenced by Gandhi, whose cosmopolitan influences included Buddhism. King's concept of the drum major instinct has resonances with Buddhist theorizations of the ego, and yet there are also important differences. King does not center existential fear as a driver for our drum major instinct. Instead, for him, it exists as a biological and universal human instinct. While I disagree with his explanation for where the drum major instinct comes from, I think he is right to focus our attention on often subconscious forces that can complicate our everyday relations as they shape events at grander political scales. King begins his sermon with childhood and describes the child as a little bundle of ego. He then describes how our instinct for supremacy shapes everyday life in adulthood, leading us to lie, boast, seek attention, engage in conspicuous consumption, and talk excessively about ourselves. King doesn't think this poor behavior is fated, even if the underlying instinct is. We can shape our drum major instinct, redirecting it towards more moral pursuits. Keep feeling the need for being important, he counseled. Keep feeling the need for being first. But he wanted his congregants to be first of moral excellence and generosity. For him, seeking to harness and redirect the drum major instinct is a high stakes affair, not only because it will improve our relationships, but also because it can forestall the very dominations that he devoted his life to undoing. As he moves through the sermon, King transitions from the interpersonal to the systemic, particularly class, race, and international relations. He notes that an unharnessed drum major instinct can become a force of classism and exclusivism, where somehow you get a degree of satisfaction because you're in something exclusive. He also argues that a lot of the race problems grow as out of the drum major instinct, a need that some people have to feel superior. Finally, writing during the Cold War, when the threat of nuclear annihilation was daily and visceral, he submits that what is wrong in the world today is that the nations of the world are engaged in a bitter, colossal contest for supremacy, running the whole gamut of life from everyday narcissism to national supremacy. The drum major instinct is, for King, a destructive force deserving of our collective attention. The drum major instinct and the will to supremacy. The word instinct does a lot of work in King's sermon. It means he needn't explain the drum major instinct's origins. It's a biological compulsion. I'm less convinced that the drum major instinct is hardwired into our human DNA. This matters because the need for being first, even when redirected towards social justice, can have a corrosive effects on movements as participants jockey for the limelight, can have, has had, geez, hampering leadership development and collective power. A criticism that was leveled against King himself by fellow civil rights activists such as Ella Baker. I prefer the phrase will to supremacy because I think it better names the contingency and changeability of the impulse. As with King's drum major instinct, I see the will to supremacy operative in the everyday while also aggregating and helping to shape systemic power relations, such as those along the axes of race, class, gender, and species. Unlike King, though, I think it can be undone and avoided, not simply redirected. I define the will to supremacy as a highly accessible and habituated compensatory craving for power over others. It is particularly accessible in death denying cultures that do not provide their members with tools for metabolizing existential fear. The will provides a hit of compensatory power that displaces uncomfortable feelings of fear and belittlement. Without alternative ways of transforming existential fear, this cycle quickly becomes habituated. Much of this processing happens below the skin and also below the radar of conscious thought. Since the publication of his 2002 book, Neuropolitics, political theorist William Connolly has been in conversation with contemporary neuroscience to alert his readers to the significant amount of identity formation that precedes, quote, below conscious awareness and the reach of direct self regulation. Because this subterranean processing is politically salient despite its inevitability, Connolly has been an early and persistent advocate for the political importance of mind body practices. Consciousness, writes Connolly, consciousness enables humans to devise experimental practices and arts by which to work on affect imbued thoughts that are operative below cognitive reasoning.
Sorry, just invisibility rather than inevitability.
Oh, thank you.
Sure. Just big
Oh, yeah.
difference.
It's totally different. Yeah. Skip right by that. But that seems like a good place to pass the stick to a willing reader.
Uh, I'm not necessarily picking up the stick, but I am
Yeah, or to talk about it.
noticing,
Yeah.
yeah, noticing that I think the drum major instinct is an interesting concept, but uh, notice just to sort of flag that that's his description, and I think it's maybe cultural rather than a human instinct. So, that there's maybe a bit of a conflating the two can mislead us a little bit. Um, and I'm thinking about it, that do we see this? Is this as pronounced in other places as it is in the U.S.? Was King describing what he was seeing in America versus again this broad human characteristic? I'm also really interested in this statement that a significant amount of identity formation proceeds below conscious awareness. And, again, why this work I think is so important because otherwise we're sort of oblivious to who we are and how we're moving through the world. Any comments or somebody want to pick up? Okay, I'll keep going. The will to supremacy and the will to power. A key inspiration for Connolly's work on neuropolitics is Friedrich Nietzsche, who, according to Connolly, poses the question of how to educate effectively imbued dispositions below the level of direct intellectual regulation. There are clear resonances between King's drum major instinct and Nietzsche's famed will to power. This is not coincidental. King cites the psychoanalyst Alfred Adler as a key influence for his sermon, and Adler drew heavily from Nietzsche in theorizing a superiority complex. King also read Nietzsche and was critical of his glorification of power. This is a fair critique, but while Nietzsche sometimes succumbs to the drum major instinct, or what I'm calling a will to supremacy, he also offers a powerful explanation for how these dominative forces come into being, something lacking in King's sermon. Having a grasp on the conditions that shape the will to supremacy offers us more agency to redirect it or ultimately undo it, the path pursued in this book. Nietzsche's work on the will to power is often mischaracterized as a celebration of domination. Instead, Nietzsche's will to power is an ontological claim about the fundamental abundance of earthly life. Against the scarcity and lack imposed on reality by other philosophers of his time, Nietzsche insisted that a fundamental exuberance shaped life. As he writes in The Gay Science, in nature, it is not conditions of distress that are dominant, but overflow and squandering, even to the point of absurdity. This energetic overflow is the will to power, which is the will to life. This is to say that Nietzsche, a fundamental richness and abundance, is coursing through all earthly life, including ourselves. Boy, that's not usually something I associate with Nietzsche. A synonym we could use for the will to power is the will to optimization. Every animal, writes Nietzsche in On the Genealogy of Morals, instinctively strives for an optimum of favorable conditions under which it can expend all its strength and achieve its maximal feeling of power. Every animal abhors, just as instinctively, every kind of intrusion or hindrance that obstructs or could obstruct this path to the optimum. And that's end quote. Nietzsche is at his best when he presents openness and generosity as a path to the optimum, one that honors earthly abundance. The noble human being helps the unfortunate, he writes in Beyond Good and Evil, but not, or almost not, from pity, but prompted more by an urge begotten by excess of power. End quote. The noble human being is animated by the feeling of fullness, of power that seeks to overflow, the consciousness of wealth that would give and bestow. Nietzsche thought both Jesus Christ and the historical Buddha were noble actors. Their generosity was a show of earthly strength aimed at helping people encounter their own basic wealth. I'm noticing the word wealth there too. When James Baldwin, in a profile written for Harper's in 1961, celebrated Martin Luther King Jr. for overcoming hatred and acting instead out of an abundance of love, there's a Nietzschean echo in his praise. It's true, however, that Nietzsche also valorizes diminutive social relations as a path to the optimum. King was right to worry. Nietzsche consistently forwarded elitist and misogynistic arguments in his writings. This is a serious limitation. And yet, a redeeming element in his work is that he also offers readers tools for diagnosing the will to supremacy that he himself buckled to. This is true for a number of the powerful but limited thinkers I engage in this book, such as Chogyam Trungpa, Rita Gross, and the Buddha himself. They all converge on existential fear and resentment as a powerful explainer for supremacy, thinking, and behavior, even as they sometimes succumbed themselves. In Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche describes the human estate as a nook of disgruntled, arrogant, and offensive creatures filled with a profound disgust at themselves, at the earth, at all life. For Nietzsche, Existential resentment can fuel compensatory bids for aggrandizement. Writing in Zarathustra about bourgeois social climbers, he argues that they acquire wealth and make themselves poorer with it. They desire power, and especially the lever of power, plenty of money, these impotent people. Felt smallness or impotence in the face of finitude propels the urge for control. Quote, the certain prospect of death could sweeten every life with a precious and fragrant drop of levity, and argues Nietzsche. But now, you strange apothecary, souls have turned it into an ill tasting drop of poison that makes the whole of life repulsive. End quote. If we could learn to affirm the totality of life, including death, and if we could learn better to enjoy ourselves, then for Nietzsche, we best unlearn how to do harm to others and to contrive harm. I want to pause there because I feel like that's
Mm.
really key for me. Both, what he says, felt smallness or impotence in the face of finitude propels the urge for control. So this idea that it is, the existential fear of death that leads to systems of supremacy. But also, and I'm saying this coming out of somebody who works in death care, the understanding that being present to death, as Nietzsche so beautifully says, sweeten every life with a precious and fragrant drop of levity. And so, yeah, I want to stop there for a moment. And also, does anybody know Nietzsche better than I do? Because I actually wasn't aware of this as part of his philosophy or teaching.
I was alert to it, but my kingdom for a modern example. I mean, I'm all for great quotes from great thinkers, but man, I would love to have some. I mean, even if it's anecdotal, to say, hey, here's an example that happened in the last 25 years or 50 years that's sort of historically not abstracted like Nietzsche's quotes, which again, I'm not at war at. Like, I'm here for a turn of a phrase, but I like the idea, but I wish that there was an example here to say like, oh, right, I never connected that, you know, the uh, the people who were trying to take over, make themselves sovereign citizens in Montana in the 1990s were part of this or something because of something they were saying. I'm just picking on those,
So, yeah. Oh, sorry for interrupting
No, no, please,
that.
Beck.
No,
I'm happy to be
um,
interrupted by you.
I was thinking about an article I remember reading sometime in the last year or so about how billionaires are obsessed with anti-aging and staying young. And
Totally.
the article talked about like the first person who's going to live to be 250 years old is already alive. And I was talking about this with my brother who has way more financial resources than the average human being. And I said, I don't think most people actually would want that. Like, it's only the people who've
Yes,
created this life where they're really not doing all that much
totally.
because, and they're putting their suffering on others that really want that life. So I think Nietzsche is probably accurate in this
Oh, I would
that,
completely agree.
yeah,
Yeah,
and that may be an example of what you're looking at, this idea
yeah.
of the everlasting life of the billionaire.
Yeah, not that I couldn't think of examples, but just in terms of thinking of the rhetoric of the way this is being written, not that
Mm,
there maybe
yeah, yeah.
there's 10 examples that are coming down the pike, but for me in that location, I'd be like, hey, and you know what, you can see it in here, and you can see it in here, and you can
Mm-hmm.
see it in here, because there is
Well,
a
I
little
think
high riding rhetoric of like, don't you get it? Just the language is so beautiful, but again, I don't think it's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I I think the Becca's example is interesting in that, like the sort of chicken and the egg, that once you have extreme wealth, is the next thing that you can avail yourself of is eternal life, or or is it that, again, that existential fear that drives you to be very dominant in the marketplace, and just that accumulation of more, more, more. and so yeah, just thinking about, well, where does it start? Like, is that the instinct that makes you want to be, a wealthy high-tech billionaire, and it continues into wanting to stay young forever, wanting to be cryogenically frozen so that, your brain can be put into a robot in 1,000 years, or I don't actually know what the plan is. It all seems pretty bonkers to me, but
I think definitely some of the plan is to be the first, like to be the first guy with the head in the jar, the first guy who lives the longest, the first guy who makes it to 150, not even just for the lack of death, but just the beating the other guys.
This all reminds me of a story. I can't remember who wrote it, but basically, this wealthy man came across, I don't know, let's say a mage or something, or some kind of wizard or something that granted him everlasting life. But then he was buried alive, and so he had to spend eternity buried alive. And I just find that all these wealthy billionaires, even though that they're alive, they're basically buried alive in their wealth,
Totally.
not really doing much.
And the world they're creating is literally going to bury them alive.
Yeah, exactly. And everyone else too, basically.
Yeah.
well, Matthew, your wish for an example, like I feel that, I mean, sort of just look around, and
Totally.
I feel like we're surrounded by, again, the insatiable appetite and the always wanting more, which, to be fair, I'm making that leap saying, well, one is the cause, again,
Right.
this existential fear of death is causing that behavior, and maybe that's a little um, unfair, or unsupported. But and
Yeah.
Michelle, to your point, and this is where mindfulness, I find, a really useful tool or teacher, because that idea of being buried, you live forever but you're buried in sand, or what have you, that the absence, the lack of consideration for relationship is something that I notice over and over again, that never seems to get discussed. It's what I want for myself, the accumulation, the endless, you name it, endless piles of money, endless years of living, um, endless, I don't know, McDonald's hamburgers or something. But where is the consideration for, what am I in relationship with, what am I in community with, how am I tending those bonds, and what is my life without that web of interconnection?
I think it would be really lacking if you had no connection, which I guess why being, other than being horribly suffocated or crushed under a pile of sand, but exactly, you don't have all of those connections. And it also makes me think, I'm sorry, I keep referring to other stories, but it also reminds me of the story by Edgar Allan Poe called The Count of Amontillado, or The Cask of
Oh, the
Amontillado.
Casco
Yeah,
Amontillado. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And the guy essentially gets, bricked up in behind a wall, right? And uh, never mind that he's essentially again buried alive, but he also, like, some of the torture is that he loses all connection to everything, right? And he is cut off from everything. And again, that is that kind of lack of relationship. I mean, and maybe it didn't bother him that much because the person that was buried alive was kind of a terrible person. I think, if I'm remembering the story right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's kind of a, I forget the word for it. Anyway, just another example of what a lack of relationship can do.
Michelle, you should check out the movie Buried Alive. There's a lot more buried alive things just to check out.
Okay. You
Just
should
we're
you should send me an email and just send me all of the buried alive stuff.
I had some curiosity or interest around the sentence about if we could learn to affirm the totality of life, including death, we could learn better to enjoy ourselves. Um, for me, if I'm having some success with the former, enjoying myself isn't what shows up. I feel like beauty and like realizing a lot of seeing the beautiful in things shows up, but uh, and I think there's a pleasantness and warmth sometimes or awe that comes up with that. But I don't think I get all the way to enjoy myself. And I don't know if that's just my own personal state at the moment or just because there's a lot going on right now. But yeah, and I wonder how much enjoying ourselves then contributes to the following of unlearning the harm or contriving to harm. And just something I was curious about.
I do. I mean, I note that that's he's quoting Nietzsche, and it's just a fragment of a sentence there. And so I also sort of wondered, like, I wonder what came before or after, because I'm not sure that's the word I would use either. Um, I do use joy, though. Um, that being involved in community death care and the community itself, I would say, is a really joyful community. There's a celebration of life. And I do think it's because death is included versus considered to be a separate thing. Um, but I don't know that I agree. Enjoy yourself almost feels a bit, yeah, there's something maybe a bit thin in that. And the other thing that I notice is wanting to have the caution around making it transactional, that oh, I'm going to do this so I can get that, and that's I think kind of a habitual risk that we face. So I do appreciate an oblique approach, and so having a mindfulness practice, um, being a witness to our own mortality, our own finitude, uh, doing it because it's a healthy practice and not because I think I'm going to get something out of it. But then, the reality is there is something that arises, something that emerges, or so I have found.
Kelly, I was, one of the things as you were talking was reminded, I do work in the end of life field as well, or at least volunteer in it. When I talk to people um, outside of that work and they ask me, why do you do that and what do you get out of it? As I describe sort of the elements of working in the field, without realizing it sometimes, I use the word enjoy. I enjoy working with these people. And there is an aspect of a joy because you are touching people at a certain point in their life and their death, uh, and able to meet them there. And there is an element of joy there. But I think to lay people, it certainly is a very disturbing thing to hear. Say I enjoy working with dying people. It doesn't connect. And I think, as you're mentioning it and talking about it, I think there's just some element that there probably is not a word that we have found in common to describe that. And so enjoy, I think, comes closest because of the way I think it touches our hearts and minds as we work with people in this space.
Thanks, Ed. Asher, I saw you unmuting.
Oh, I yeah, there's a lot, but I think what I'll just say in response to your comment is the piece about learning to better enjoy ourselves feels a bit of a academic, rhythmic sort of self-citation with so page 10, his stated alternative to the unmetabolized, sort of existential resentment or fear of death is, a deep affirmation of earthly life, right? And so it seems like what he's done here is sort of pull this phrase from Nietzsche to sort of keep coming back. Never mind that there's some things I'm finding pretty thin. Nietzsche criticized Schopenhauer often for his sort of allegiance to and connection with Buddhism. I think selling a deep affirmation of early life as a Buddhist tenet is pretty thin also. So I'm struggling a little. I'm coming for the ride, but I'm struggling a little with how these citations are being. It feels a little bit like cherry picked and then self-referencing. But I do think that was kind of the point of that phrasing, is to keep hearkening back to the alternative of existential resentment and unmetabolized fear of death is a deep affirmation of early life, or to learn to better enjoy ourselves. I'm just not sure that it stitches well together. Anyways, that was just,
There.
I'm wrestling. I remuted for a reason. I probably should have just kept the mute on.
No, I'm glad you're unmuted because I'm going to ask you to pick up if you would.
Oh boy.
Thank you.
We're at according to Connolly, right?
Yeah.
That's right.
Can you tell me which page? Because I came in like
Page
We're on-
31, first full paragraph on page 31.
thank you.
Yeah. According to Connolly, Nietzsche is the philosopher who seeks to elicit a non-theistic reverence for life to combat the subterranean politics of resentment. The danger of resentment, according to Connolly, is that, quote, those who resent the world too much are eager to find others to hold responsible for their condition. They easily become punitive and exclusionary. And I just, for what it's worth, one of the things that I'm also wrestling with, just to put a bookmark in, or maybe some other people can come along with me later, I actually am struggling a little with the straight line from the drum major instinct to the will to supremacy. The energetically feels pretty different. On the one hand, I'm not saying there wouldn't be a powerful argument to make in rooting them both in sort of existential fear or anxiety or exploration, but the desire to lead and to be seen and to be validated feels different than the need to actually dominate others. I don't even know that I necessarily just see them as two sides of the same coin, to say, look at me, here I am, I want to be the leader, versus looking for people to oppress, to reify my life essence, and to lean into the violence of that. Those feel like pretty different energies, and I did not find the lead from one to the other particularly convincing. So just throwing that out there.
That's
I
why I wanted
wonder-
examples
yeah.
to see what he was talking about.
So to tell you the truth, Matthew, I didn't want to interrupt, but I think I missed the beginning of the question, so I didn't grasp it. So I thank you for telling me that those were connected.
Yeah, they were.
Yeah. I'm glad to see him getting here now, though, because this feels like at least part of the bridge that wasn't there. In other words, existential resentment is a force that shapes individual and collectivized performances of supremacy. Too consumed by his own resentments and compensatory urges, Nietzsche never fully developed his existential explanation for domination. Some of the thinkers covered in this book, like Georges Bataille, William Connolly, James Baldwin, and Ernest Becker, have built on Nietzsche's arguments, using them to diagnose dominative social relations. I dwell on Nietzsche because he's had an important influence on thinkers covered in the following chapters, but also because he helps clarify the mechanics of what I am calling the will to supremacy. I agree with Nietzsche that we humans are aggregates of multiple and sometimes competing forces, composed of multiple atoms, cells, and organs, and supported by billions of bacteria, we're an orchestration more than a solo performance. Thus, it should not be surprising that sometimes competing impulses are operative within our organism, and likewise that our conscious minds are often unaware of the underlying tensions. In the Nachlass materials posthumously, published under the title Will to Power, Nietzsche elegantly defines life, including human life, as a multiplicity of forces connected by a common mode of nutrition. The will to supremacy is one of the many relations of force or pulses of energy operative within our organisms. Existential resentment is another. The diverse thinkers examined here agree that it's easy for the human animal to feel fearful, small, and resentful in the face of an immense world and finite existence. Likewise, if these feelings go unaddressed, they can prompt the pursuit of self-aggrandizement and power over others. Yeah, okay, so he's bringing them much more into conversation here. Nietzsche's account of microphysical relations. Nietzsche's account of microphysical relations of force influenced Michel Foucault's famous analytics of power. Power, writes Foucault, must be understood in the first instance as the multiplicity of force relations immanent in a sphere in which they operate. And yet Foucault subtracted Nietzsche and Bataille's analysis of existential resentment from his work. This was a substantial loss for Foucault and his wide readership, since Nietzsche helps explain why power relations so regularly turn dominative, a crucial turn that Foucault, to my knowledge, never explains. Without cultural resources, stories, ritual, ceremony, other mind-body practices to soothe the pulses of fear and resentment, we feel as finite and fleshy beings. The compensatory will to supremacy becomes more attractive. Neither existential resentment nor the will to supremacy is automatic, but both are highly accessible, becoming even more so through habitual repetition, if they are not met with a counterforce. Because resentment and compensatory urges can bubble up below the skin and conscious awareness, Because resentment and compensatory urges can bubble up below the skin and conscious awareness, any cultivated counterforce must work on the affective plane, addressing itself to embodied and unspoken fears. Should I pause there for a sec? Do folks have comments, concerns, clarifications, praises?
I see your point about King versus Nietzsche, the drum major instinct and will to power. But I wonder if he's using King as an example because, of course, King was very focused on systems of oppression, racism that was directed against African Americans, and so maybe that's why he's using him as an example rather, than saying it's not necessarily to suggest that there is a strong and obvious link between the two, but there's at least an echo. And I do also appreciate this idea that, because a lot of this is below conscious awareness, we need to work the affective plane, that we're maybe not going to talk ourselves out of it or think our way out of it.
It is interesting, though, and maybe he'll tease this out, but to associate or almost synonymize the affective plane with embodiment, because I wouldn't necessarily make that leap. Yeah. I did appreciate your earlier point, though, Kelly, asking about, because there's something in the drum major instinct that assumes an individualism, like as the baseline cultural framework, and looking at individualistic versus collectivistic cultures, but then also inquiring about the nature of being seen as worthy and as capable of leadership and as dynamic and visible and unique in the context of the unique oppression that Black people in America faced. And it is interesting, and maybe James Baldwin will get there, but to not give that any treatment, felt like, okay, there is a unique context that's being spoken to there, perhaps.
Mhm.
And Pittman, were you coming in?
I was coming in to ask you to tease that apart a little bit if you're willing. This affective plane and embodiment, are you seeing this as divergent or?
Oh no, I think I was sort of inquiring as I was saying it, because on the one hand, a lot of the time when I'm working with folks, and there will be an inquiry into, okay, so what do we mean when we use this word, whether it's angry or unhappy or whatever emotional language we're talking about, and tease that out. And a lot of it will be, okay, what's happening in the body? What is the experience state? Also, the nature of the thoughts that are going on in the mind, the way that the mind will verbalize certain things. It just seemed here that the affective, or sort of the emotionally oriented world, or the appeal or the way of working with a human being in their emotional plane, was being essentially equated with embodiment. And I think we can work with the body in a way that's not explicitly affective, and we can work with the affective capacity of human beings without necessarily doing embodiment practice. So it just was an interesting assumption. And I know that you work with the body a lot, Anne. So if you see it differently, I'm certainly open to hearing it.
Well, I don't, I think I appreciate what you're saying. I like that that pulling apart. I'm not sure if we have a shared agreement of what embodiment means
Mm,
at all, whether that's because many people that I work with would think, well, thought isn't in there. Like there's no mental capacity in embodiment.
mm,
Um, and I just think it's a yeah, I guess I'm also struggling a little bit with the idea of the unconscious equated a little bit with more of a essence of embodiment than the conscious.
mm.
Anyway, I'm in the what does he mean by all of it? I'm still not totally sure. I'm not actually sure that we get to a definition of embodiment, do we, in this book? I'm not sure if we do.
I don't.
I don't recall.
Yeah.
And
Anyway.
I would the idea that I don't know that I'm not hearing an association of the unconscious with embodiment um, as much as it's the, sort of the back door that that some of these things, some of these beliefs, some of these values we hold because we're not aware of them, um, that we're operating, being operated by. And so that's one piece. And that an embodied practice, some of these things, stories, ritual, ceremony, um, is a way that we can be directing or engaging that part of ourselves, which is where those things, those values, those beliefs lie. I feel like that was pretty inarticulate, but like again, that we probably just can't read an essay and then be like, okay, great, now I'm not going to oppress anyone ever again.
Um,
Yeah, go ahead, Matthew.
oh, just that Kat put in the chat that she says the sentence is essentially arguing that deep emotional healing or transformation requires more than cognitive reframing. It demands emotional attunement, somatic awareness, and compassionate engagement with what's felt but not said.
Nice.
Beautiful.
And see, if
Beautiful.
that's what we're here, I would totally, yeah, like that. I think my issue is the affective plane as standing in for all of that feels like a lot to attribute to the affective plane. That's all.
Yeah.
Ironically, and sometime you and I will have to sit down and have a conversation about the subconscious and what the body acts as storage system, because that actually I have less trouble making that leap, but some other time.
Will the
Okay,
winner
well,
get? Will the loser get buried alive?
Just for a day.
Okay.
we'll just have a virtual arm wrestle.
Should we do Buddhism, basic anxiety, and the will to supremacy, or somebody else want to pick up?
And can we lean on you to read a little
Oh, you
bit?
bet. You bet.
And I'll say too, for those of you that came in late, we're now just anybody jump in. I think everybody gets how we do this kind of book club. So please join whenever you feel that you'd like to be a reader.
We also get the Cat Lloyd is winning the chat, so you're
Nice.
crushing it, Cat Lloyd. Whoop whoop.
I love it. Buddhism, basic anxiety, and the will to supremacy. I really appreciated that last comment, though, with regard to, where's that jump to the supremacy? Anyway, well, perhaps this will be a foundation. My understanding of existential fear, the will to supremacy, and the importance of embodied strategies for transforming them is profoundly shaped by Buddhist analysis of ego formation. Pivoting from Nietzsche to Buddhism is not as abrupt as it might seem. There are resemblances between Nietzsche's view of the self as a multiplicity of forces and the Buddhist view. Walpola Rahula, in his classic text, What the Buddha Taught, describes the self as a combination of physical and mental aggregates, which are working together independently in a flux of momentary change. These resonances may not be coincidental. Nietzsche engaged Buddhist sources, and in his book, Greek Buddha, Christopher Beckwith convincingly argues that early Buddhism directly influenced ancient Greek thought, particularly the skeptics Nietzsche drew from. This means that Buddhist thought has been indirectly woven into Western philosophy from its beginnings. There are, however, consequential differences between Nietzschean and Buddhist views of the self. While Nietzsche emphasizes the multiple forces that make up the self, he thinks that functionally it's worth assuming a unity, even if it isn't real. We need unities in order to be able to reckon. Our ability to cultivate ourselves in tune with the abundance of earthly life is helped by the myth of a unitary self. Nietzsche calls the unitary human ego our oldest article of faith, and yet it is a faithfulness he is willing to abide by despite its disjuncture with reality. This is a dangerous proposition from a Buddhist perspective, since our attachment to the myth of a bounded and autonomous self is not only misaligned with reality, but is also, according to Rahula, the source of all troubles in the world, from personal conflicts to wars between nations. In short, to this false view can be traced all the evil in the world. Oof. For Tibetan Buddhist teacher Chogyam Trungpa, we cling to the mythology of the autonomous self because this article of faith works to soothe the existential fear that is hard to avoid in our ultimately mysterious and uncertain existence. Describing the ongoing process of self-formation, very different. Trungpa notes that before intention begins, there is a state of utter uncertainty, in the sense of a generally dull and stupefied state of mind. That uncertainty or bewilderment occurs every fraction of a second in our state of being. It goes on all the time. Trungpa also describes this state as basic anxiety, which for me is synonymous with what I've been calling existential fear. There's so much to wonder about in all these sentences. Oh my goodness. We are spat into this massive and confusing world with no say. And we're likely to exit with the same lack of agency. Birth and death, the two fundamental bookends to our lives, are almost entirely beyond our control. It is understandable that we might feel fearful about an existence we did not author and have limited control over. Without embodied resources at our disposal to metabolize our often subconscious feelings of basic anxiety, those feelings can easily take the shape of inadequacy. For Trungpa, in the tradition of ego-oriented culture, death is seen as a defeat and an insult. Yeah, I like that. I suppose that's what I witness most in the work that I'm doing, is this defeat and insult. Stop me if you want to chat. To cope with these subcutaneous and often subconscious pulses of fear and uncertainty, we pursue a reliable and compensatory counterforce which shores up the autonomous self and the sense of control it provides. If we can exist as discrete beings bounded from the unpredictability of the world, then that is the first step toward exerting further control on that world, bringing it to heal. We would like to possess our world, writes Trungpa, and so we act in such a way that whatever we see around us is completely in order, according to our desire to maintain the security of me, myself, which is egohood. The pulse of energy I'm calling the will to supremacy is alive in our first graspings for the self, which then become a reliable staging ground for it. This is to say that what King calls the drum major instinct and what I'm calling the will to supremacy are preconditions for and the products of the fictive self. It's hard to imagine effectively undoing the will to supremacy without also undoing the myth of the bounded self that it feeds into and helps reinforce. In his book, Buddhism and Political Theory, Matthew Moore argues that Nietzsche's counsel to persist in the illusion of the unified self injects resentment against existence back into his theory. Pretending that the world is different than it really is, continues Moore, because we cannot accept the reality, is the root of resentment. And as Nietzsche himself helps us understand, existential resentment is an energetic pulse that can reinforce dominative impulses, feeding ignoble behavior. Whew, maybe I'll stop there and see if there's thoughts, arguments, comments. Karen Reppin, we're on page 33.
And Karen Reppin, I sent you a message telling you that, but you didn't look.
Karen Reppin, what are you doing?
Karen Reppin, get your act together.
I'll read out Matthew's comment too for future listeners that Peter Kingsley also makes this Buddhist to Greek philosophy connection with his book, A Story Waiting to Pierce You.
I had a question about just before the end of that sentence. It says, because we cannot accept the reality is the root of resentment. rather than resentment? It's in.
Oh, good
Ressentiment.
one.
Resentiment.
Good one.
It's French.
Okay, so I was just wondering if there's
Uh-huh.
significance to that and why it's in italics. I don't know.
Yeah. Good catch.
Like, why would that be pulled out? Because then he says, they say resentment in the next sentence. So I don't know. Don't know.
Guessing that, you know, ressentiment is making it a philosophical concept rather than just resentment as an experience or feeling that we have. Oh, there's Cat.
Cat Lloyd
Excellent.
killing
For
the
the
chat.
win.
Woo.
Ressentiment is a philosophical concept that describes a deep, often unconscious form of resentment that arises when someone feels powerless to act on their frustrations or perceived injustices. It's not just anger, it's a repressed emotional state. Oh, that's very interesting. That festers and reshapes values, often turning weakness into moral superiority. Thank you, Kat. And Corey continues from Wiley. The resultant resentment is likely to be transitory, as described in phrases such as taking umbrage or feeling piqued. In contrast, ressentiment is, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly, is more likely to persist and to become intensified.
Chat game
Something
is
I learned
strong.
tonight. Yes,
Chat
thank
game
you.
strong.
Well, good to know it. There is a difference and it happens to sound like it's important. So there you go. Thank you.
Yeah.
Chat game is strong, except for Karen Reppin, who didn't see that she'd been messaged.
But
Unbelievable, Karen.
Karen's hair looks great, so she gets a pass.
No, Karen always looks great. I mean, love Karen Reppin hard.
It's my birthday.
Yeah, it is.
Happy birthday, Karen. Yay.
And I was buried alive yesterday, just so you know.
Oh.
Seriously, I was the dearly departed in a mock burial. And it was quite something. So anyway, I'm sorry I'm late. I'm glad I'm here. Thank you so much.
Very welcome. Glad to have you here. And to your question though, of like, is there anything people want to say? I'm just feeling this is a lot. So like, there's just so much to talk about.
Oh, honestly.
Kelly, you got more in the chat.
Oh, Michelle was saying to Karen that she'd love to hear more.
About being buried, I think is.
Yeah, about being buried.
Okay. Well, I'm affiliated with a natural burial ground. And periodically we do community awareness building. And recently we've had a couple of natural mock burials where, well, I'll just tell you what happened yesterday. I was shrouded on a gurney and loaded into a funerary hearse van. And we drove down to the parking lot at the entrance of this burial ground, and 60 people who had signed up for this experience that they were just curious about, had no idea what was going to happen. They gathered around, and our cemetery director gave a very brief introduction as to what was happening. And and 6 people were asked to volunteer to lift my body from the gurney onto a pallet and laid down. That was set down on the ground. And then there were poles, 3 poles that 6 people could carry me, and I was carried into the cemetery. It was quite a walk. I couldn't see anything. I mean, I had a shroud over my face. It was very quiet, and one of the comments that I had after we finished was, "I'm hiring keeners." It was just too quiet. But anyway, we walked up to the grave site, which had been prepared, and I was lowered down into the ground, and I had a couple of, and right prior to moving me into the cemetery, there was a reading. It was a blessing of sorts. I mean, we really tried to make this as authentic as, I mean, it was authentic, I'll tell you. Otherwise, I was not dead. I was still breathing, but it was something. Anyway, I noticed as I was lowered into the ground that my body had been very tense. I was trying to be really still and acting the part. I was also, I think my body was quite tense because I was a little concerned that those carrying me might list to a side or not. And I didn't want to fall off the pallet because it was quite narrow. But I have to tell you, the moment I was lowered into the grave, my body just melted into it. I just completely involuntarily relaxed. And then there were some more readings, and the most beautiful song was played, and I heard people crying. And then I had people were throwing or dropping flowers into the grave. And that was pretty much it until people kept saying, are you ready to come out? And I really wasn't, which I thought was interesting. And it's being, then I walked back to the entrance out of the cemetery, and this is a beautiful wooded area. It's in a valley. It's a big nature preserve. I mean, it's a jungle this year because we had so much rain this summer. And but there are bark mulched paths. So I walked out, and then we had a big Q&A with all of the people that had gathered, and those who wanted to stay, we kind of showed them about shrouding, and a couple of people their bodies were shrouded, and it was just a really beautiful thing. And the whole thing was being recorded also by a woman that Lana Greenleaf, who is doing a big documentary on a lot of death related topics. And nobody sent me any images, so I have no idea how beautiful it was, but I was told that it was quite a beautiful burial. So if you have any other questions, I'm happy to answer, but it was quite moving. And I have to say that it was a little odd for me because today is my birthday. My father died on my birthday. His birthday is tomorrow. So I was a day before my birthday, and I was dying. And my dad died a day before his birthday. And that really it just passed through my mind as being a little synchronistic. So I was hoping that I kept breathing. And with that, again, thanks for asking.
Thank you, Karen. That's really potent. And you have me thinking about, I've had the question in the early goings of this book, the talk about practices so that we can help to undo systems of oppression and, come into relationship with our own mortality. And just in hearing you tell that story, I realized that, oh, right, so community death care, we actually do this work with these these events and teachings that we offer to the public. So yeah, it feels like a nice little bit of keep going.
And also such a wonderful example of just earlier, I don't know if you were here, Karen, we were talking about working beneath the sort of intellectual or like superficial layers of mind and information, and how to access where, yeah, the subtler places where these views are really taking hold. And there's this conversation about whether the affective plane was justifiably being used as a summary for all of that. And this was sort of a wonderful example of kind of one of my suspicions, which was you just putting your body in the way of something and tapping into something very deep for yourself and others, and an embodied practice that wasn't primarily affective, but it had an affective effect, right? And just what it is sometimes just to put your body in the way of death contemplation and to see what arises. So thank you for, it felt very on topic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, I'll pick up again. Figure 2.1 represents my argument's basic flow. I begin with Trungpa's Buddhist assumption that basic anxiety, existential fear, is unavoidable for fragile human beings living on this vast planet, which is spinning in an even vaster and more mysterious cosmos. Basic anxiety includes a cluster of related fears, uncertainty, the unknown, fallibility. But I concur with Trungpa's former student Pema Chodron that death is the most fundamental of all fears. Without cultural resources for metabolizing our fear, it is easy for anxieties to settle into patterns of felt belittlement and inadequacy. Recall that Hegel called death the absolute master, equating finitude with enslavement. Following along the circuit depicted in Figure 2.1, feelings of belittlement and inadequacy in the face of a vulnerable and uncertain existence easily morph into a dripping resentment toward the seeming shit show we've been born into. We are fragile and finite beings, bossed around by hunger, the weather, our bladders, by time and by death, the absolute master. And Figure 2.1, which is an effective circuit to supremacy, shows 5 little balloons. And the first is basic anxiety, leading to inadequacy, leading to resentment, leading to the will to supremacy, and then, the big bubble becoming sediments into social structures that reinforce relations of supremacy. We compensate for our felt inadequacy and servility by imposing ourselves on the natural world and other people to exert the control we feel is fundamentally lacking from our basic existence. According to anthropologist Ernest Becker, a primary influence for the terror management theories covered in Chapter 5, quote, all power is in essence power to deny mortality. Either that, or it is not real power at all, not ultimate power, not the power that humankind is really obsessed with. Power means power to increase oneself, to change one's natural situation from one of smallness, helplessness, finitude, to one of bigness, control, durability, importance. End quote. This is a fine description of how uninterrupted subconscious feelings of existential inadequacy and resentment shape a will to supremacy. I think it's important to see the continuities between a will to supremacy, which can sound exceptional, the preserve of other people, and the fiction of the unified self that so many of us operate from, because they clarify how close at hand dominative impulses can be. This plays out politically in systemic injustices such as white supremacy, but also in the everyday narcissisms named by King that strain relationships, communities, and social movements. For example, a growing number of critics such as Adrienne Marie Brown, Sarah Schulman, Olufemi Taiwo, Catherine Liu, and Francis Lee have raised concerns about the corrosive effects of call-out culture on the left, where often discursive missteps by social movement participants come to consume considerable activist attention, distracting from the vital structural transformations that are the ultimate movement goals. These critics do not deny the importance of accountability and challenging comrades to be better, but there is a growing consensus that a drum major instinct, or will to supremacy, is lurking behind the collective enthusiasm for punishment that is making social movements harder places to be. Schulman, Taiwo, and
Preach.
sorry?
I just said preach. That's all.
Oh, yeah. And Brown all point to the role of trauma in shaping a hyperjudgmental and punitive activist outlook. Indeed, Schulman proposes deep similarities between the behaviors of those with unresolved trauma and those animated by supremacy ideology. Quote, my conclusion, she writes, from this experience of noticing the similarity of behavior between the projecting traumatized person and the entitled self-aggrandizing supremacist person is that both need and want dominance in order to feel comfortable. End quote. For Schulman, this linkage makes sense, since so often a supremacist outlook is rooted in unresolved trauma. I'm going to pause there. I'm just thinking about the fact that this book came on the heels of Rowe spending time at I'm blanking. What was the protest that happened here in New York after the financial crisis?
Occupy.
Occupy, thank you. That he spent time with the Occupy movement, and I think that really, like seeing what was happening both on the left as well as what's happening in the broader world, really, I think both galvanized and influenced James Rowe. But I'm also, pausing on the term the unified self. He used it previously, but I'm just thinking about how in other programs I teach, we talk a lot about the fact that all of the new science is showing us that the myth of the separate self is really being undone. That whether it's quantum theory, whether it's the new neurosciences, we are being shown and coming to understand over and over again that everything is in relationship with everything else. And so there just isn't the separate ego individual. And it makes me wonder are we going to fight harder to maintain that myth, that illusion? Or can we step into frankly a more kind of nourishing, I think appealing understanding of ourselves? Somebody else want to pick up the reading or other thoughts? Karen, yeah.
I don't know if this is relevant or not, but I've been reading more about Freud's whole theory on wounded healers and also countertransference, and how very often our own trauma can it's basically said in this last paragraph that you read, that in order for us to feel comfortable, we have to somehow overcome that or gain some sort of superiority over the trauma, rather than learning how to deal with it in another way, become familiar with it, learn about our shadow side, it seems like the shadow side just automatically takes over. Or it's more easily the one that the force that takes over rather than, which is not our intent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's all.
Yeah, that subterranean, subcutaneous forces that we're just not, if we don't, I think we have to work to be aware. In chapter 3, and Carmen has said, Pema Chodron identifies cruelty as opposites or enemies of compassion. Cruelty is a defense mechanism against our own fear and pain, leading to a desire to hurt others. Thank you, Carmen. And yeah, okay. In chapter 3, I engage with writer Resmaa Menakem's argument that white supremacy is rooted in the unmetabolized trauma of European descended people, many of whom experienced brutal violence and marginalization before crossing the Atlantic. A question that follows from Menakem's analysis is, why were Europeans dominating and traumatizing one another before their violence was directed toward Black and red bodies on other continents? In other words, is there an even deeper trauma that continues to condition a will to supremacy for white-bodied people? For James Baldwin, that deeper trauma is the ongoing force of existential fear and resentment, what psychiatrist and Buddhist writer Mark Epstein calls the trauma of everyday life. For Epstein, just being a person in this world brings suffering because of how insignificant we feel and how impermanent we are. Without cultural resources capable of transforming basic anxiety, inadequacy, and existential resentment, we move through the world with large stores of dangerous fuel at the ready, fuel that helped shape our very selves and that we easily burn through under the right circumstances, contributing to structures of dominance or engaging in everyday narcissisms that diminish our chances of collectively undoing those structures. As I cover in chapter 3, political trauma from experiences of oppression and the existential traumas that flow from the fact of finitude often compound to shape the will to supremacy. For Menakem, for example, it is the unresolved feelings of inadequacy that many white people have inherited from their ancestral histories of colonial violence. English peoples colonizing Irish people, or Roman people colonizing the English, that fuels the will to white body supremacy. There is a growing body of work on how mind-body practices can transform the traumas caused by oppression and their personal and political effects. This book contributes to that literature by highlighting the trauma of everyday life, the existential fear and resentment that is rampant in a death-denying culture and liable to shape defensive and supremacist outlooks, aggravating the effects of other unresolved traumas. I should be clear that unless otherwise noted, when I reference resentment in the pages of this text, I mean the existential resentment depicted in figure 2.1. Political resentment or anger against oppressors is highly generative and generally non-neurotic. Political anger is quite distinct from the existential resentment that is my primary focus. In Red Skin, White Masks, Yellowknives Dene scholar Glenn Coulthard makes a strong case for political anger and resentment, noting that in the context of ongoing settler colonial injustice, Indigenous peoples' anger and resentment can indicate a sign of moral protest and political outrage that we ought to take seriously, if not embrace as a sign of our critical consciousness. Like James Baldwin and Resmaa Menakem, however, Coulthard does note that political resentment can lead to internalized forms of violence if it's not directed effectively. The oppressed can take out the pain of belittlement on those closest to them. I suspect that in these cases, existential and political resentment are layered on top of each other, creating a heavy burden that the affected seek to unload. while I return to the relationship between these two forms of resentment in Chapter 3. My primary focus throughout this book is on existential resentment, or the everyday trauma named by Epstein. And stopping there. Thoughts, reflections? I appreciate the reminder that, these things tend to reinforce and then maybe amplify each other. Asher, do you feel he's starting to name his terms a little better?
I am suspending judgment for the moment. But sorry, yes, I would have liked sort of the reference to resentment to come a little bit earlier, but yes, I'm coming along.
And are we moving at an okay pace for folks? I know some of it's a bit heady. Thanks, Carmen. Well,
Yeah.
we are about to go into another section, transforming basic anxiety into appreciation for basic goodness. So I think that is a good place to break. But of course, if there's any other comments or shares, we have time. Thanks, Andrian, for your message.
I'm looking forward
Kelly,
to goodness.
oh, Anne,
I'm just looking forward to basic goodness.
Bring it.
And look within yourself, Anne. Just look within yourself. Or Karen Reppin. Karen also has it.
Subconscious, not embodied.
I would like to share a gift with you all, a birthday gift, and that is the reading that I asked to have read while I was in the grave. So maybe we can end on that.
Please.
It may be a soothing piece. It's called Learning from Trees by Grace Butcher. If we could, like the trees, practice dying, do it every year, just as something we do, like going on vacation or celebrating birthdays, it would become as easy a part of us as our hair or clothing. Someone would show us how to lie down and fade away, as if in deepest meditation. And we would learn about the fine, dark emptiness, both knowing it and not knowing it. And coming back would be irrelevant. Whatever it is the trees know when they stand undone, surprisingly intricate, we need to know also, so we can allow that last thing to happen to us as if it were only an ordinary thing. Leaves and lives falling away, the spirit, complex, waiting in the fine darkness to learn which way it will go.
Beautiful. Thank you, Karen.
Would you repeat who that's by?
Grace Butcher, Butcher.
I'm going to pause the recording here because I think that's a beautiful note for our future listeners to end on. So thank you all.